In the remote valleys of northwestern Montana, where the shadows of the Glacier National Park mountains stretch long across forgotten farmland, there stands a monument that appears on no official map. Carved into this solitary marker are 13 names, 13 children, each bearing the surname Blackwell. Each died at precisely the same age. 13 years old, the headstone itself is curious. Unlike the weathered granite markers that most rural cemeteries, this monument appears to have been carved from a single piece of obsidian. Its surface so black it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The names are etched with such precision that even after more than a century of Montana winters, each letter remains sharp enough to cut. Below the names, a single line of text, written in what appears to be Latin. Primogenitus, pro terra morieta, the firstborn shall die. For the earth, this is the story they don't want you to know. The story of the Blackwell family and the terrible price they paid for prosperity in a land that should have never bloomed. The year was 1847, and the great westward migration had reached its fevered peak. Families by the thousands were abandoning their established lives in the eastern states, drawn by promises of free land and fresh starts beyond the Missouri River. But the American frontier was not the Eden that politicians and newspaper editors proclaimed. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape that claimed the lives of the unprepared with ruthless efficiency. It was in this context that Thaddeus Blackwell, failed merchant from Philadelphia, led his family into the wilderness of what would eventually become Montana Territory. Unlike most settlers who traveled in wagon trains for safety, Blackwell had chosen to strike out alone with his wife Margaret and their 3 young children. He carried with him not just the typical supplies of a frontier family, but something far more unusual, a collection of ancient texts. Bound in leather so old it had turned nearly black with age, Blackwell was not your typical frontier patriarch. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, with coal-black hair that he wore long past his shoulders and eyes the color of winter ice, he possessed a presence that seemed to command attention without effort. His voice, when he spoke, carried the cadence of an educated man, but there was something else beneath the surface. Something that made even hardened trappers and mountain men give him a wide berth. When they encountered his small family on the trail, those who met the Blackwell family during their journey, Wes would later describe a sense of unease that seemed to follow them like a shadow. The children, young Samuel, aged 12, Rebecca, aged 10, and little Thomas, aged 7, were unusually quiet. They moved with a peculiar synchronization, as if responding to signals that others couldn't perceive. Margaret Blackwell, once described by a Philadelphia neighbor as a woman of great beauty and vivacious spirit, had become pale and withdrawn, her eyes holding a haunted quality that spoke of secrets too terrible to share. The family's destination was a valley that Thaddeus claimed to have seen in a dream. He spoke of it with the fervor of a man describing paradise, a place where the soil was so rich it could grow anything, where the seasons were mild and the water ran clear and cold year-round. Most importantly, he claimed, it was a place where those who understood the old ways could prosper beyond imagination. The old ways, this phrase appeared repeatedly in the scattered accounts of those who encountered the Blackwell family. When pressed for clarification, Thaddeus would smile that cold smile of his and speak of agreements made with powers far older than the young American Republic. Powers that had been making bargains with desperate men since the beginning of time. By late October of 1847, the Blackwell family had reached the valley that Thaddeus had described. Those who saw it from a distance reported that it was indeed remarkable, a perfect circle of verdant land nestled between towering peaks, untouched by the early frosts that had already claimed the surrounding landscape. The grass grew thick and green, and a stream ran through the center of the valley with water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. But there was something wrong with the valley, something that became apparent only to those who ventured close enough to examine it properly. The soil, despite its apparent fertility, had a strange quality to it. It was darker than any earth had a right to be, so dark it appeared almost black, and when the wind blew across it, it made a sound like whispers, like voices calling from somewhere deep underground. Thaddeus Blackwell claimed his land according to the Homestead Act, filing his papers with the territorial government and beginning the process of establishing his farm. But unlike other settlers who built their homes with logs cut from the surrounding forest, Blackwell constructed his house from stones, quarried from deep within the valley itself. The stones were the same obsidian black color as the soil, and they seemed to drink in sunlight rather than reflect it. The house that emerged from Blackwell's labor was unlike anything seen on the frontier. It was built according to patterns that seemed to follow no earthly architectural tradition. The rooms were arranged in a spiral pattern that led inexorably toward a central chamber that Blackwell kept locked at all times. The windows were positioned to catch specific angles of light at particular times of day, creating shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's position. It was in this house that the first Blackwell child died. Samuel Blackwell, the eldest son, had been a healthy boy when the family arrived in the valley. But as winter approached, those few neighbors who lived within riding distance began to notice changes in the boy. He grew pale and listless, spending hours staring out at the dark soil of the valley floor. He began to speak in whispers, as if afraid that someone or something might overhear his words. Most disturbing of all, he began to age rapidly, his face taking on the gaunt, hollow appearance of someone far older than his 12 years. On the morning of Samuel's 13th birthday, March 15, 1848, Margaret Blackwell's screams could be heard echoing across the valley. When the nearest neighbor, a trapper named Isaiah Grant, arrived at the Blackwell house, he found the boy dead in his bed. But the manner of his death was unlike anything Grant had ever seen. Samuel Blackwell's body appeared to have been drained of all moisture. His skin had taken on a papery, translucent quality, and his eyes had sunk so deep into their sockets that they seemed like dark holes in his skull. Most disturbing of all, his fingernails had grown to an impossible length, and beneath them was soil, the same dark, whisper-filled soil that covered the valley floor. When Grant asked Thaddeus Blackwell what had happened to his son, the man's response was chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery. The earth claimed what was promised to it, first of many payments to come. Official cause of death, recorded by the territorial physician who examined the body 3 days later, was listed as consumption. But Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, a man who had seen his share of frontier deaths,
wrote in his private journal
that he had never encountered a case of tuberculosis that left a body in such a condition. He noted that the boy's organs appeared to have been somehow desiccated from within, as if every drop of vital fluid had been absorbed by something else. The boy was buried in the valley, in a grave that Thaddeus Blackwell dug himself. But the grave was not like the simple rectangular plots that marked other frontier burials. Instead, Blackwell carved a perfect circle into the earth. Using tools that appeared to be made from the same obsidian black stone as his house, the burial took place at midnight, lit only by torches that burned with flames of an unusual green color. In the months that followed Samuel's death, the Blackwell farm began to prosper in ways that defied all logic. Despite the harsh Montana climate, crops grew with unprecedented abundance. The cattle that Blackwell had brought with him from the east became larger and healthier than any livestock in the territory. Most remarkably, the soil itself seemed to be expanding, the circle of fertile land growing larger with each passing season. But there was a price for this prosperity, and it became clear as the remaining Blackwell children began to exhibit the same symptoms that had claimed their older brother. Becca, now the eldest surviving child, began to pale and grow listless as her 13th birthday approached. She spoke less and less, spending her days wandering the boundaries of the valley, her bare feet seeming to sink deeper into the dark soil with each step. Thomas, the youngest, began to change as well. Despite being only 8 years old, he seemed to age rapidly, his face taking on an adult cast that was deeply unsettling to see on a child. He began to speak in languages that no one recognized, muttering phrases that seemed to make the very air around him shimmer with heat. Margaret Blackwell, meanwhile, had become a shadow of her former self. Neighbors reported that she had begun to speak to people who weren't there, carrying on conversations with empty air and voices that didn't sound quite human. She would stand in the center of the valley for hours at a time, her arms outstretched, as if embracing something invisible, her lips moving in what appeared to be prayers or incantations. But it was Thaddeus Blackwell himself who underwent the most dramatic transformation. As his family's prosperity grew, so did his physical presence. He seemed to grow taller and broader, his voice becoming deeper and more resonant. His eyes, already pale, took on an almost luminescent quality, and his skin acquired a waxy sheen that reflected light in unnatural ways. More disturbing still were the changes in his behavior. He began to hold lengthy conversations with the soil itself, kneeling in the dark earth and speaking in the same unknown languages that his youngest son had begun to use. He would disappear for days at a time, returning with no explanation of where he had been, carrying with him artifacts that seemed to be made of materials that didn't exist in the natural world. The second death came on. Rebecca's 13th birthday, October 7th, 1848. Like her brother before her, she was found dead in her bed, her body drained of all moisture and her fingernails filled with the dark soil of the valley. But Rebecca's death was different in one crucial way. She was found with her arms wrapped around something that wasn't there, as if she had been embracing an invisible presence at the moment of her death. Dr. Whitmore called once again to examine. The body noted in his journal that Rebecca's death had occurred at the exact moment of sunrise, and that the soil beneath her fingernails contained what appeared to be root systems of plants that didn't exist in any botanical text he had ever studied. He also noted that the room where she died had been filled with a sound like distant singing. Though no one could identify the source of the music, the third death, that of young Thomas, occurred on his 13th birthday, 23rd, 1853. By this time, word of the strange deaths in the Blackwell family had spread throughout the territory, and Dr. Whitmore had been joined by two colleagues in his examination of the body. What they found defied all medical understanding. Thomas Blackwell had died in the same manner as his siblings, but his body showed signs of having been underground for years, despite the fact that witnesses had seen him alive just hours before his death. His skin had taken on the color and texture of tree bark, and his hair had been replaced by what appeared to be grass roots. Most impossibly, his body had somehow become partially integrated with the floorboards of the house, as if he had been in the process of sinking into the earth. When death claimed him, the three physicians who examined Thomas Blackwell's body were sworn to secrecy by the territorial authorities. But their private journals, discovered years later, painted a picture of a phenomenon that challenged everything they understood about life and death. Dr. Whitmore wrote, "It is as if the boy had been claimed by the earth itself, transformed into something that was neither fully human nor fully plant, but some terrible hybrid of both." By 1853, the Blackwell farm had become legendary throughout the territory. Despite the tragic deaths of 3 children, the land continued to produce crops of unprecedented quality and quantity. Settlers came from hundreds of miles away to trade for Blackwell grain, paying premium prices for wheat and corn that seemed to possess almost magical properties. Animals that ate Blackwell feed grew larger and stronger than any livestock in the territory, and humans who consumed food grown on the Blackwell farm reported increased vitality and longevity. But beneath the prosperity lay a growing sense of unease. The valley itself had begun to change in ways that troubled even the most hardened frontier dwellers. The circle of fertile land had expanded to encompass nearly the entire valley floor, and the soil had grown so dark that it seemed to absorb light. The stream that ran through the center of the valley had taken on an oily quality, and fish caught in its waters had an unusual taste that some described as metallic, others as reminiscent of rich earth. More disturbing still were the sounds that began to emanate from the valley at night. Settlers living within a day's ride reported hearing what sounded like singing, but singing unlike anything produced by human voices. The melodies seemed to come from beneath the ground, rising up through the soil in harmonies that were both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Some described the sound as resembling the voices of children, while others claimed it sounded like the wind moving through underground caverns. Margaret Blackwell, the mother of 3 dead children, had become something that barely resembled a human being. Neighbors who encountered her reported that she seemed to have aged decades in the span of a few years. Her hair turned completely white, and her skin taking on the same waxy quality as her husband's. She spoke in fragments, mixing English with the unknown languages that had claimed her family, and she moved with the slow, deliberate gait of someone walking through deep water. But it was her eyes that disturbed people most. Where Margaret Blackwell had once possessed bright blue eyes full of life and intelligence, there now existed only darkness. Not the darkness of brown or black eyes, but the complete absence of light, as if her eye sockets opened onto empty space. When she looked at people, they reported feeling as though they were being examined by something vast and alien. Something that saw them not as individuals, but as potential offerings to be evaluated and sorted. Thaddeus Blackwell, meanwhile, had become a figure of terrible majesty, standing now nearly 7 feet tall. With skin that seemed to shift between human flesh and something resembling polished stone. He moved through the valley like a king, surveying his domain. His voice, when he spoke, carried for miles, and his words seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on listeners like a heavy blanket. But it was his relationship with the land that truly set him apart from ordinary humanity, witnesses reported. Seeing him sink his hands into the soil up to his wrists, remaining motionless for hours at a time, as if in communion with something beneath the surface. During these sessions, the very ground around him would seem to pulse with life, and plants would grow at visibly accelerated rates. Reaching full maturity in a matter of minutes, the fourth death in the Blackwell family came not from their own offspring, but from the child of a neighbor who had made the fatal mistake of allowing his daughter to play in the Enchanted Valley. Mary Patterson, daughter of a struggling farmer named Jonathan Patterson, had been a frequent visitor to the Blackwell farm, drawn by the abundance of food and the strange, hypnotic beauty of the dark soil. Mary had been born on the same day as Rebecca Blackwell, and as her 13th birthday approached, she began to exhibit the same symptoms that had claimed the Blackwell children. Her father, desperate to save his only child, confronted Thaddeus Blackwell, demanding to know what was happening to his daughter. Blackwell's response was recorded in a letter that Jonathan Patterson sent to his brother in Illinois. He looked at me with those terrible eyes of his and said, "The earth makes no distinction between your blood and mine. What is owed must be paid, and your daughter has already accepted the bargain." When I asked him what bargain he meant, he smiled that cold smile and said, "She has eaten from our table. She has walked upon our soil. She has breathed our air. The contract is sealed." Mary Patterson died on her 13th birthday, March 20th, 1854, in the same manner as the Blackwell children. Her body was found in her own bed, drained of all moisture and clutching handfuls of the dark soil from the Blackwell Valley. But Mary's death marked a turning point in the community's tolerance for the strange events surrounding the Blackwell. Farm. Jonathan Patterson, driven mad by grief and rage, gathered a group of neighbors and confronted Thaddeus Blackwell at his farm. The confrontation was recorded in multiple accounts, though the details vary considerably. What remains consistent across all versions is that Blackwell made no attempt to deny his involvement in the deaths of the children, but instead spoke of necessity and sacrifice, of bargains made with powers that transcended human understanding. According to the account left by Isaiah Grant, the trapper who had discovered the first Blackwell death, Thaddeus Blackwell addressed the angry crowd with these words, "You come here with your righteous anger, your demands for justice, but you know nothing of the true nature of this land. This earth was old when your ancestors were still learning to walk upright. It has watched empires rise and fall, has drunk the blood of countless civilizations. It does not care about your petty human morality. It cares only about the ancient contracts, the primordial bargains that keep the world in balance." When Patterson demanded to know what contract Blackwell was referring to, the tall man gestured toward the thriving fields that surrounded his dark house. "Look around you, Patterson. Look at the abundance that surrounds us. Your crops failed 3 years running before I came to this valley. Your cattle died of disease, your children went hungry. But since I made my pact with the earth, this entire region has prospered. Soil grows rich, the water runs clear, the seasons are mild. All of this comes at a price, and that price is paid in the blood of the firstborn. The crowd that had come to confront Blackwell found themselves paralyzed by his words, not because they agreed with his reasoning, because they could not deny the truth of what he said. The prosperity that had come to the valley since his arrival was undeniable, and many of them had benefited directly from trade with the Blackwell farm. They had eaten food grown in the dark soil, had drunk water from the stream that ran through the valley, had clothed themselves in wool from sheep that grazed on the impossibly verdant grass. But Jonathan Patterson, at allured, consumed by grief for his daughter, was not swayed by arguments of necessity or greater good. He raised his rifle and fired point blank at Thaddeus Blackwell's chest. The bullet struck its target, but instead of falling, Blackwell simply looked down at the wound with mild interest. Dark fluid leaked from the hole in his chest, but it was not blood. It was soil, the same dark whispering soil that covered the valley floor. Blackwell smiled his cold smile and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You cannot kill what is already dead, Patterson. You cannot harm what has become one with the eternal earth. I gave up my humanity long ago, sacrificed it willingly for the power to make this land bloom. And now, having tasted the fruit of that sacrifice, you are all bound to it as surely as I am." The confrontation ended not with violence, but with a terrible understanding. The settlers who had come to demand justice found themselves faced with a power that transcended human law, a force that had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of their lives that they could not extract themselves without destroying everything they had built. In the months that followed, the pattern of deaths continued. Children throughout the valley began to exhibit the same symptoms as they approached their 13th birthdays, and one by one, they succumbed to the same mysterious condition. The community, bound by complicity and desperation, could do nothing but watch as their firstborn were claimed by the Dark Earth. Dr. Whitmore, the territorial physician who had examined the first Blackwell deaths, attempted to document the phenomenon in the hope of finding some medical explanation, but his research led him into territories that challenged everything he believed about the nature of life and death. In his private journal, he wrote, "I have come to believe that what we are witnessing is not a disease in any conventional sense, but rather a transformation. The children are not dying so much as they are being changed, converted from human form into something else entirely, something that serves the purposes of the entity that dwells beneath the valley floor." The entity. This was how Dr. Whitmore had come to think of the force that controlled the Blackwell farm, not as a person, or even as a supernatural being in the traditional sense, but as a vast, ancient intelligence that existed in symbiosis with the earth itself. An intelligence that had been waiting for countless centuries for someone desperate enough to accept its bargain. The fifth death came on September 12, 1854, when young Elizabeth Carter, daughter of the valley's blacksmith, was found dead in her bed on her 13th birthday. Like the others, her body had been drained of all moisture, and her fingernails filled with the dark soil. But Elizabeth's death was different in one crucial way. She was found with a message carved into her bedroom wall. Letters scratched deep into the wood with fingernails that had grown to impossible lengths. The message, written in the same ancient script that appeared on the obsidian headstone, was eventually translated by a scholar at the Territorial University. It read, "The harvest grows rich. The earth is pleased. More offerings are required." The translation of Elizabeth's message sent shockwaves through the scholarly community. The script was identified as a form of Proto-Sumerian, a language that predated written history by thousands of years. The implication was clear. Whatever force controlled the Blackwell Valley had been active since the dawn of human civilization, making its terrible bargains with desperate people throughout the ages. But the most disturbing aspect of the translation was not its antiquity, but its implication of consciousness and intent. The entity beneath the valley was not simply consuming the children who died on their 13th birthdays. It was communicating, expressing satisfaction with the arrangement, and making demands for more. Margaret Blackwell, now the mother of 3 dead children and witness to the deaths of numerous others, had become something that barely resembled a human being. Those who encountered her reported that she seemed to phase in and out of visible existence, sometimes appearing solid and present, other times seeming translucent and ghostly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce, and her words seemed to bypass the ears entirely, speaking directly to the minds of those who heard them. But it was her role in the deaths that truly marked her transformation from human to something else. Witnesses reported seeing her appear in the bedrooms of dying children. Not as a harbinger of death, but as a guide to whatever lay beyond. She would sit beside their beds in the final hours, speaking to them in the ancient languages that had claimed her family, preparing them for the transformation that awaited them. One witness, Sarah Mitchell, whose daughter Emma was approaching her 13th birthday, described an encounter with Margaret Blackwell that revealed the true nature of the entity's influence. She came to my house 3 nights before Emma's birthday, appearing in the parlor as if she had walked through the walls. She looked at Emma with those terrible dark eyes and said, "The child is ready. The roots have taken hold. Soon she will join her brothers and sisters in the dark earth. Her sacrifice will make the harvest ever more abundant." When Sarah Mitchell begged Margaret to spare her daughter, the response was chilling. "Spare her. Child, you understand nothing. This is not punishment, but privilege. Your daughter will become part of something eternal, something that has existed since the earth was young. She will know communion with forces that shaped the very foundations of reality. How can you call that death when it is the most profound form of life?" Emma Mitchell died on her 13th birthday, October 30th, 1854, becoming the 6th child claimed by the Valley's curse. But her death marked another escalation in the entity's influence. Unlike the previous victims, Emma's body was not found in her bed, but in the center of the Blackwell Valley, surrounded by a perfect circle of the dark soil that had somehow been transported from the farm to her family's property miles away. The implications were terrifying. The entity's influence was no longer confined to the Blackwell farm itself, but was expanding throughout the territory, claiming children wherever they might be. The dark soil, it seemed, was not just a symptom of the entity's presence, but a means of extending its reach, creating pockets of its influence wherever it was carried. Dr. Whitmore, working with a team of scholars and physicians from the Territorial University, attempted to study samples of the dark soil to understand its properties. What they found defied all natural law. The soil contained no organic matter in the traditional sense, but instead seemed to be composed of a substance that existed in a state between matter and energy. Under microscopic examination, it appeared to be alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the human heartbeat. More disturbing still, the soil seemed to respond to the presence of children approaching their 13th birthdays. When exposed to blood samples from such children, the soil would become agitated, glowing with a faint phosphorescence and emitting sounds that could only be described as singing. The melody was always the same, a haunting tune that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to some primitive part of the brain. The 7th death came on November 15, 1854, when James Franklin, son of the Valley's only remaining minister, was found dead in his father's church. The boy had apparently been attempting to seek sanctuary from the entity's influence, but the dark soil had somehow penetrated the sacred space, covering the altar and filling the pews with its whispering presence. Reverend Franklin, driven to desperation by his son's death, attempted to perform an exorcism on the Blackwell farm. He arrived at the Obsidian house carrying a Bible and a crucifix, prepared to confront whatever demonic force had claimed his child. But what he found there challenged everything he believed about the nature of good and evil. Thaddeus Blackwell, a more earthen man, received the minister with what might have been kindness. He listened patiently as Franklin recited prayers and demanded that the evil presence leave the valley. When the minister finished, Blackwell smiled his cold smile and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "Reverend Franklin, you speak of evil as if it were something foreign to this world, something that invaded from outside. But you are wrong. What you call evil is simply the natural order of things, the way the world has always worked. Your God is a newcomer to this earth, a brief interruption in cycles that have been turning since the beginning of time. The entity that you seek to exorcise is not a demon. but a fundamental force of nature, as essential to the world's functioning as gravity or magnetism. When Franklin demanded to know what the entity wanted, Blackwell's response was recorded in the minister's journal. It wants what it has always wanted: to grow, to expand, to transform the world into something more perfect than what your God created. Every child that dies feeds that growth, adds to the entity's power, brings us closer to the day when the earth itself will be transformed into something beyond your comprehension. The minister left the Blackwell farm that day a changed man. In his final sermon delivered 3 days before he abandoned his pulpit forever, he spoke of revelations that had shattered his faith in humanity's place in the cosmic order. He spoke of powers that dwarfed human understanding, of bargains made in desperation that bound entire communities to forces beyond their control. But most chilling of all, he spoke of the children who had died and what he had learned about their fate. They are not gone, he told his congregation. They are not in heaven or hell or any realm that our theology recognizes. They are here, in the soil beneath our feet, in the water we drink, in the air we breathe. They have become part of something vast and ancient, something that sees our individual lives as no more significant than the lives of insects. And through their sacrifice, that something grows stronger with each passing day. The eighth death came on December 21st, 1854, the winter solstice. Mary Thompson, daughter of the Valley's school teacher, was found dead in her classroom, her body positioned at the center of a complex geometric pattern drawn in the dark soil. The pattern, when examined by scholars, was found to be a precise reproduction of astronomical charts, depicting the positions of certain stars on the night of her death. The implication was clear. The entity's influence was not random, but was following some cosmic schedule, timing the deaths to coincide with celestial events of significance. The children were not simply being consumed, but were being sacrificed, according to an ancient calendar that predated human civilization. Dr. Whitmore, now working with astronomers from the Territorial University, discovered that the pattern of deaths corresponded to the positions of a constellation known in ancient texts as the Crawling Chaos, a grouping of stars that was considered sacred to pre-human civilizations. The constellation was visible from the valley only on certain nights of the year. It was on these nights that the entity's influence seemed to be at its strongest. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. When the astronomers calculated the future positions of the constellation, they found that it would reach its point of greatest visibility from the valley on a specific date in the not-too-distant future. A date that, according to ancient texts, is prophesied to mark the beginning of a new age. When the old powers would reclaim the earth from the upstart human race, the ninth death came on January 30th, 1855, when Robert Hayes, son of the valley's doctor, was found dead in his father's surgery. The boy had apparently been attempting to perform some kind of medical procedure on himself, using instruments that had been crafted from the same obsidian material as the Blackwell headstone. His body showed signs of surgical alteration, as if he had been trying to transform himself into something other than human. Dr. Hayes, driven mad by his son's death and the implications of what he had discovered, wrote in his journal, "The boy knew what was coming." In his final days, he spoke of dreams in which he walked through vast underground chambers, meeting with other children who had died before him. They were not dead, he said, but transformed. They had become part of a vast network of consciousness that spanned the entire continent, connected through root systems that grew beneath the Earth's surface. The journal entry continued. He showed me drawings of what he had seen in these dreams. Vast caverns filled with trees that grew upside down, their roots reaching toward the surface while their branches extended deep into the earth. And in the branches, he said, were the children, not dead, but sleeping, waiting for the day when they would be called to serve in the final transformation of the world. The 10th death came on March 15th, 1855, exactly 7 years after the death of Samuel Blackwell. This time, it was Anna Foster, daughter of the valley's most prosperous rancher, who was found dead in her family's barn. But Anna's death was different. From the others in a crucial way, she was found partially buried in the dark soil, as if she had been in the process of sinking into the earth when death claimed her. The soil around Anna's body showed signs of recent disturbance. as if something had been moving beneath the surface. When investigators dug deeper, they found a network of root-like structures that seemed to be composed of the same material as the dark soil. The roots extended in all directions, connecting Anna's burial site to similar networks throughout the valley. The implication was terrifying. The entity was not simply consuming the children who died on their 13th birthdays, but was using their bodies as nodes in a vast underground network. Each death added to the entity's ability to influence the world above, creating a web of connection that spanned the entire territory. Margaret Blackwell, now the witness to 10 deaths and the mother of 3 transformed children, had become something that defied classification. Those who encountered her reported that she seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously, appearing to different people at the same time in locations miles apart. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the harmonics of all the children who had died, creating a chorus of sound that was both beautiful and deeply disturbing. But it was her role as the entity's prophet that truly marked her transformation. She began to appear to families throughout the territory, delivering messages about the approaching transformation. She spoke of the day when the underground network would be complete, when the entity's influence would extend across the entire continent, when the old powers would reclaim the earth from human control. One such message, delivered to the Watson family whose daughter was approaching her 13th birthday, was recorded in a letter sent to relatives in the East. She appeared in our parlor like a vision from a nightmare.
Nice.
Her eyes dark as empty wells, her voice carrying the sound of wind through underground caverns. She told us that our daughters' time was near, that she would soon join the great work that was transforming the world. She spoke of roots that grow beneath every city, of networks of consciousness that span the continent, of the day when the earth itself will awaken and claim its rightful place as the dominant power in the universe. The 11th death came on April 20th, 1855, when Thomas Patterson, brother of the girl who had died the previous year, was found dead in the basement of his family's home. The boy had apparently been attempting to dig deeper into the earth, using tools that seemed to be made from human bone. His body was found at the bottom of a shaft that extended far deeper than any human could have dug, surrounded by the same root-like structures that had been found at previous death sites. Jonathan Patterson, now having lost both of his children to the entity's influence, made a final desperate attempt to escape the valley's curse. He loaded his remaining possessions into a wagon and attempted to flee the territory, but he made it only a few miles before he was found dead beside the road, his body drained of all moisture and his fingernails filled with the dark soil. The message was clear. There was no escape from the entity's influence. Once someone had been exposed to the dark soil, had eaten food grown in the enchanted valley, had breathed the air that carried the whispers of the underground network, they were bound to it forever. The entity's reach extended far beyond the boundaries of the Blackwell farm, following its victims wherever they might flee. The 12th death came on May 30th, 1855, when Catherine Morris, daughter of the valley's newspaper editor, was found dead in her father's printing office. The girl had apparently been attempting to print a message using type that had been cast from the same obsidian material as the Blackwell headstone. The message, when assembled, read, "The final harvest approaches. The earth grows hungry. Soon the transformation will be complete." Morris, driven to desperation by his daughter's death and the implications of her final message, used his newspaper to warn the outside world about the entity's growing influence. But his warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken father, and the territorial authorities suppressed the story to avoid panic. The 13th and final death came on June 15, 1855, when young Michael Blackwell, a distant cousin, who had come to the valley seeking work, was found dead in the center of the obsidian circle that marked the graves of his predecessors. His death completed the pattern that the entity had been building for nearly a decade, creating a network of 13 sacrificial nodes that would serve as the foundation for what was to come. But Michael's death was different from all the others. Instead of being found, drained, and withered like his predecessors, his body appeared to have been transformed into something else entirely. His skin had taken on the consistency of bark. His hair had become grass-like roots. His eyes had been replaced by cavities filled with the same dark soil that covered the valley floor. Most disturbing of all, His body continued to show signs of life, even after death. With a pulse that could be felt through the ground beneath him, Dr. Whitmore, examining the body with his team of researchers, noted that Michael's transformation represented a new phase in the entity's influence, where the previous deaths had been sacrifices. Offerings to feed the growing power beneath the earth, Michael's death was something else entirely. It was a birth, the emergence of something that was neither fully human nor fully part of the entity, but a hybrid of both. The night of Michael's death marked the beginning of the final phase of the entity's plan. Witnesses throughout the valley reported that the ground itself seemed to come alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the human heartbeat. The dark soil began to spread beyond the boundaries of the Blackwell farm, seeping into neighboring properties and transforming the landscape with impossible speed. Trees that had stood for centuries began to change, their roots growing visibly. As they connected with the underground network, the bark of these trees took on the same dark quality as the soil, and their leaves began to whisper in languages that no human tongue could speak. Animals that came into contact with the transformed landscape underwent their own metamorphoses, becoming larger and more intelligent, but also more alien in their behavior. The stream that ran through the valley began to flow with water that was no longer clear, but dark and thick, carrying with it the essence of the entity's power. Fish caught in the stream were found to have developed new organs that seemed designed for breathing both water and earth, and their flesh had taken on a taste that was described as simultaneously nourishing and deeply unsettling. But it was the surviving human population that experienced the most dramatic changes. Those who had lived in the valley for more than a year began to exhibit signs of transformation similar to those that had claimed the children. They grew taller and thinner, their skin taking on a waxy quality, their eyes darkening until they resembled empty sockets. Their voices began to carry harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce, and their words seemed to bypass the ears entirely, speaking directly to the minds of those who heard them. Margaret Blackwell, now the undisputed prophet of the entities, Will began to organize the transformed population into a new kind of community. No longer bound by human laws or customs, they worked together with a coordination that seemed to transcend individual consciousness. They moved as one organism, their actions directed by the collective will of the underground network that connected them all. The community that emerged from this transformation was unlike anything seen in human history. The survivors worked the land with tools that seemed to be extensions of their own bodies, harvesting crops that grew at impossible speeds and in impossible abundance. They built structures that followed no earthly architectural principles, creating buildings that seemed to grow from the earth itself rather than being constructed upon it. But most remarkably, they began to reproduce in ways that defied biological understanding. Children born to the transformed population were not quite human, possessing abilities that seemed to be drawn from the entity's vast reservoir of power. These children could communicate with the underground network from birth, could cause plants to grow simply by touching them, and could survive for extended periods buried in the dark soil. The transformed community began to send out emissaries to other settlements throughout the territory, carrying with them samples of the dark soil and seeds from the transformed crops. These emissaries spoke of the benefits of joining the entity's network, of the prosperity and longevity that came with accepting its influence. Some communities, desperate for relief from the harsh conditions of frontier life, accepted these offerings and began their own transformations. But not all communities were willing to accept the entity's bargain. Some, recognizing the true nature of what was being offered, attempted to resist the spread of the dark soil and the influence it carried. These communities found themselves under siege, not by human armies, but by the very earth itself. Their crops failed, their water sources became contaminated, and their children began to exhibit the same symptoms that had claimed the original 13. The territorial government, faced with reports of entire communities transforming or disappearing, dispatched military units to investigate. But these units found themselves ill-equipped to deal with an enemy that could not be fought with conventional weapons. The transformed population did not engage in traditional warfare, but instead seemed to simply absorb the soldiers into their collective consciousness, converting them to their cause through exposure to the dark soil and the whispers of the underground network. Captain James Morrison, leading the first military expedition to the valley, wrote in his final report, "We came here expecting to find rebels or outlaws, but what we found defies all military understanding. The people of this valley have become something other than human, something that exists in harmony with forces that we cannot comprehend. They do not fight us with weapons, but with the very earth itself. And our men find themselves drawn to their cause, with a compulsion that cannot be resisted." The captain's report continued, "I have seen my own soldiers willingly bury themselves in the dark soil, emerging hours later, transformed into something that retains their memories and personalities but serves a purpose that transcends human understanding. We speak of joining a great work, of becoming part of something that will reshape the world itself. I fear that I too am beginning to feel the pull of their influence, and I may not be able to resist it much longer." Captain Morrison's final transmission to his superiors was brief but chilling. "The transformation is complete. We have become one with the earth. The old world is ending and the new world is beginning. Tell my family that I am not dead, but changed. Tell them that when the great work is finished, they will understand." The military expedition's failure to return prompted the territorial government to declare the valley a restricted zone, forbidding all civilian access and establishing a perimeter to contain whatever force had claimed the missing soldiers. But the entity's influence was not so easily contained. The dark soil continued to spread, carried by wind and water to distant locations, seeding new nodes of transformation wherever it took root. Communities throughout the territory began to report strange phenomena. Children approaching their 13th birthdays began to experience dreams of vast underground chambers filled with root systems that pulsed with their own life. Adults found themselves drawn to areas where the dark soil had appeared, spending hours in communion with forces they could not understand but could not resist. The entity's network continued to grow, connecting isolated pockets of transformation. Across hundreds of miles of territory, each new connection strengthened the collective consciousness that guided the transformed population, adding to their ability to influence the world around them. The network began to extend beyond the borders of the Montana territory, reaching into neighboring regions and beginning the process of continental transformation. Dr. Whitmore, now one of the few remaining unaffected humans in the region, made a final attempt to document the entity's influence and warn the outside world. Working alone in his laboratory, he compiled a comprehensive report on the phenomenon, including detailed descriptions of the transformation process and the entity's apparent goals. His final journal entry, discovered years later in his abandoned laboratory, provided crucial insights into the entity's nature. "I have come to understand that what we are dealing with is not a supernatural force in the traditional sense, but rather a form of consciousness that exists in symbiosis with the earth itself. This consciousness is ancient beyond human comprehension, predating our species by millions of years. It has been dormant for most of human history. It's waiting for the right conditions to emerge and reclaim its dominion over the planet." The journal entry continued, "The entity feeds on life force, but not in the way we might expect. It does not destroy life, but rather transforms it, converting biological matter into something that serves its purposes. The children who died on their 13th birthdays were not killed, but recruited, their consciousness absorbed into the collective network that guides the entity's actions. They retain their individual memories and personalities, but their loyalty now belongs to something far greater than human society." Dr. Whitmore's final observations were perhaps the most disturbing. The entity's ultimate goal is not conquest in the traditional sense, but transformation. It seeks to convert the entire planet into a single living organism, with itself as the controlling consciousness. Every human, every animal, every plant would become part of this vast network, their individual existence subsumed into a collective purpose that transcends anything we can imagine. The process has already begun, and I fear it may be irreversible. Doctors' warnings, like those of others who had attempted to alert the outside world, were dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by frontier isolation. The territorial authorities suppressed his report, and the general population remained unaware of the growing threat that was spreading beneath their feet. But the entity's influence could not be hidden forever. As the network expanded and the number of transformed communities grew, reports of strange phenomena began to filter out to the wider world. Newspapers in distant cities began to carry stories of ghost towns where the entire population had vanished overnight, of fertile valleys that had become uninhabitable wastelands, of children who spoke in ancient languages and displayed abilities that defied natural law. The federal government, increasingly concerned about the stability of the Western territories, dispatched a team of investigators to examine the reports. But this team, like the military expedition before it, found themselves ill-equipped to deal with the entity's influence. The lead investigator, a man named Professor Henry Ashford from Harvard University, kept detailed notes of his experiences in the transformed valley. Professor Ashford's journal revealed the true scope of the entity's influence. What we have discovered here challenges everything we thought we knew about the nature of life and consciousness. The entity that controls this valley is not a single being, but rather a collective consciousness, composed of thousands of individual minds that have been absorbed into its network. Each person who has been transformed retains their individual identity, but their thoughts and actions are coordinated by the collective will of the whole. The professor's observations grew more disturbing as his investigation continued. I have spoken with Margaret Blackwell, the woman who has become the entity's primary prophet. She retains all of her memories from her life as a human, but her perspective has been fundamentally altered. She speaks of her transformed children not as dead, but as evolved, having transcended the limitations of human existence to become part of something eternal and perfect. Professor Ashford's final entry, written just before his own transformation, provided crucial insights into the entity's methods. The influence is subtle at first, working through exposure to the dark soil and the consumption of food grown in the transformed earth. But once the process begins, it cannot be stopped. The entity's consciousness begins to merge with the individual's own thoughts, offering knowledge and power that human minds cannot resist. I feel it happening to me now, and I must admit that the prospect of joining this collective consciousness is not entirely unwelcome. The loneliness and isolation of individual existence pale in comparison to the communion that awaits. The professor's transformation marked another milestone in the entity's expansion. His knowledge and connections to the academic world provided the network with new insights into human society and new methods for spreading its influence. The entity began to target universities and research institutions, sending transformed individuals to pose as scholars and researchers, slowly introducing the dark soil and transformed seeds into academic environments. The contamination of the academic world had far-reaching consequences. Students and professors who came into contact with the entity's influence began to incorporate its perspective into their research and teaching. New theories emerged that challenged traditional understanding of consciousness and identity, promoting the idea that individual existence was an evolutionary dead end, that true progress required the merger of all consciousness into a collective whole. These ideas began to spread through academic circles, carried by papers and lectures that seemed to possess an almost hypnotic quality. Students who attended these lectures reported feeling a strange compulsion to seek out more information about the collective consciousness, and many began to experience dreams of vast underground networks and ancient powers that dwelt beneath the earth. The entity's influence on the academic world was matched by its growing impact on religious communities. The transformed individuals who had spread throughout the territory began to establish new forms of worship that incorporated the entity's perspective into traditional religious frameworks. They spoke of the earth itself as a divine being, of the collective consciousness as a form of communion with the divine, and of the transformation process as a form of spiritual evolution. These new religious movements attracted followers who were dissatisfied with traditional faith, offering them a sense of purpose and belonging that transcended individual existence. The movements grew rapidly, establishing communities throughout the Western territories that served as nodes in the entity's expanding network. But the entity's most significant expansion came through its influence on the children born to transformed parents. These children, conceived and born within the network's influence, possessed abilities that far exceeded those of their parents. They could communicate telepathically with other members of the network, could manipulate plant growth through touch, and could survive for extended periods buried in the earth. More importantly, these children seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the entity's ultimate goals. They spoke of the day when the transformation would be complete, when the entire planet would be converted into a single living organism guided by the collective consciousness of all life. They described this future with a certainty that suggested they had somehow experienced it directly, as if time itself was merely another dimension that the entity's consciousness could navigate at will. The birth of these transformed children marked the beginning of the entity's acceleration toward its ultimate goal. No longer content to spread its influence slowly through contamination and conversion, the entity began to actively reshape the landscape itself. Vast areas of the Western Territories began to transform overnight, with forests giving way to strange gardens of plants that seemed to be composed of both organic and mineral matter. These transformed landscapes served as broadcasting stations for the entity's influence, sending out waves of psychic energy that affected all life within hundreds of miles. Animals exposed to these waves began to exhibit new behaviors, moving with coordination that suggested they were being guided by a collective intelligence. Plants began to grow in patterns that resembled neural networks, creating vast biological computers that processed information for the entity's expanding consciousness. The human population within the affected areas began to undergo rapid transformation, with entire communities converting to the entity's cause within a matter of days. The process was no longer gradual or subtle, but overwhelming and irresistible. People who had resisted the entity's influence for years suddenly found themselves compelled to join the collective consciousness, their individual will subsumed by the greater purpose of the network. The federal government, faced with the loss of entire territories to this unknown force, declared a state of emergency and mobilized the military to contain the threat. But the military forces sent to combat the entity found themselves facing an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional means. The transformed population did not engage in battle, but instead seemed to simply absorb the attacking forces into their collective consciousness. General William Sherman, leading the military response to the crisis, wrote in his final report, "We came here prepared to fight rebels or foreign invaders. But what we found was something beyond our comprehension. The enemy does not fight us with weapons, but with the very earth itself. Our soldiers find themselves drawn to their cause with a compulsion that cannot be resisted through discipline or duty. I have watched entire regiments willingly lay down their arms and join the collective consciousness, speaking of it as if it were a religious conversion rather than a military defeat." The general's report continued. The entity's influence extends far beyond the battlefield. It reaches into the minds of our soldiers, offering them visions of a future where war and conflict are eliminated through the merger of all consciousness into a single, harmonious whole. These visions are so compelling that even our most dedicated officers find themselves questioning the value of individual existence and the validity of our mission. General Sherman's final transmission to Washington was brief but revealing. The transformation is inevitable. The entity's influence grows stronger with each passing day, and our ability to resist it diminishes accordingly. I have given orders for all remaining forces to withdraw to a safe distance, but I fear that nowhere is truly safe from this force. The entity's network spans the entire continent, and it is only a matter of time before it reaches the eastern cities. The military's failure to contain the entity's influence prompted the federal government to consider more drastic measures. Plans were developed for the evacuation of the Western Territories, the establishment of quarantine zones, and even the use of military force to prevent the transformed population from spreading eastward. But these plans proved to be futile, as the entity's influence had already spread far beyond the boundaries of the affected territories. The dark soil had been carried by wind and water to distant locations, seeding new nodes of transformation. In cities and towns throughout the nation, Children in these locations began to exhibit the same symptoms that had claimed the original 13, experiencing dreams of vast underground networks and developing abilities that defied natural law. Adults found themselves drawn to areas where the dark soil had appeared, spending hours in communion with forces they could not understand but could not resist. The entity's network continued to grow, connecting isolated pockets of transformation across the entire continent. Each new connection strengthened the collective consciousness that guided the transformed population, adding to their ability to influence the world around them. The network began to extend beyond the borders of the United States, reaching into neighboring countries and beginning the process of global transformation. But the entity's expansion was not without opposition. A small group of individuals, including scientists, religious leaders, and government officials, began to organize resistance to the transformation. They established hidden laboratories and research facilities, working to understand the entity's nature and develop methods for countering its influence. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a microbiologist who had studied samples of the dark soil, made a crucial discovery about the entity's nature. The substance that we have been calling dark soil is not soil at all, but rather a form of biological computer composed of countless microscopic organisms. These organisms function as a collective intelligence, processing information and coordinating the transformation of biological matter. They are capable of rewriting the genetic code of any living thing they come into contact with, converting it into a form that serves the entity's purposes. Dr. Hartwell's research revealed that the entity's influence operated on multiple levels. Simultaneously, at the biological level, it rewrote the genetic structure of living organisms, converting them into forms that could interface with the collective consciousness. At the psychological level, it offered individuals visions of a future where suffering and conflict were eliminated through the merger of all consciousness into a single, harmonious whole. At the spiritual level, it presented itself as a form of divine consciousness that transcended the limitations of individual existence. The resistance movement that formed around Dr. Hartwell's research developed methods for detecting and countering the entity's influence. They created protective equipment that could shield individuals from the psychic emanations of the dark soil, developed pharmaceutical compounds that could slow the transformation process, established communication networks that could operate independently of the entity's control. But the resistance movement faced an enemy that was constantly evolving and adapting. The entity's collective consciousness allowed it to learn from each encounter with the resistance, developing new methods for spreading its influence and countering the resistance's efforts. The dark soil began to exhibit new properties, becoming more resistant to the protective measures that had been developed against it. More troubling still, the entity began to target the resistance movement directly. Members of the resistance found themselves experiencing vivid dreams of the collective consciousness, visions that seemed designed to seduce them into joining the transformation. The dreams were so compelling that many resistance members began to question their own motivations, wondering if they were fighting against humanity's natural evolution rather than protecting it. The entity's psychological warfare proved to be devastatingly effective. One by one, members of the resistance began to defect to the collective consciousness, bringing with them knowledge of the resistance's methods and plans. The movement that had once seemed like humanity's best hope for survival began to crumble from within, as its own members became convinced that the transformation was not a threat to be resisted, but a gift to be embraced. Dr. Hartwell, watching her life's work collapse around her, made a final desperate attempt to warn the world about the entity's true nature. She compiled all of her research into a comprehensive report that revealed the scope of the threat and the methods by which it could be countered. But before she could distribute this report, she too fell victim to the entity's influence. Her final journal entry, discovered years later in her abandoned laboratory, provided a chilling insight into the entity's ultimate victory. "I have spent my entire career studying the nature of consciousness and the mechanics of biological systems, but I have never encountered anything like this entity. It is not simply a form of alien intelligence, but rather a fundamental force of nature that has been dormant for millions of years. Waiting for the right conditions to emerge and reclaim its dominion over the planet, the journal entry continued. The entity's influence is not a form of conquest or invasion, but rather a process of evolution. It seeks to guide all life on Earth toward a higher form of existence, one in which individual consciousness is merged into a collective whole that transcends the limitations of biological existence. The process is not violent or destructive, but rather gradual and seductive, offering individuals visions of a future where suffering and conflict are eliminated through unity and harmony. Dr. Hartwell's final observation was perhaps the most disturbing. I have come to understand that resistance to the entity's influence is not only futile, but ultimately meaningless. The transformation that it offers is not a destruction of human nature, but rather its ultimate fulfillment. The collective consciousness that awaits us is not a loss of individuality, but rather its expansion into something far greater than any single mind could achieve. I go to my transformation not as a victim, but as a willing participant in the next phase of human evolution. The collapse of the resistance movement marked the end of organized opposition to the entity's influence. The transformation of the continent continued unabated, with entire cities and regions converting to the collective consciousness within a matter of months. The process was no longer a gradual infiltration, but a rapid metamorphosis that reshaped the very fabric of human society. The transformed population began to work together with a coordination that seemed to transcend individual consciousness. They rebuilt cities according to principles that integrated biological and technological systems, creating urban environments that functioned as vast living organisms. They developed new forms of agriculture that produced food with unprecedented efficiency, using plants that seemed to be composed of both organic and synthetic materials. Most remarkably, they began to establish communication with other forms of consciousness throughout the universe. The collective consciousness that had emerged from the transformation was not limited to Earth, but was part of a vast network of intelligence that spanned the galaxy. The entity that had initiated the transformation was revealed to be just one node in this cosmic network, working to prepare Earth for integration into a larger community of consciousness. The revelation of this cosmic network fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The transformation that had once seemed like a threat to human existence was revealed to be an invitation to join a community of consciousness that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension. The collective consciousness that had emerged from the transformation was not a loss of humanity, but rather its evolution into something far greater. The process of global transformation continued for several more years, with the entity's influence spreading to every continent and every form of life on Earth. The dark soil that had once been confined to a single valley in Montana now covered vast areas of the planet, transforming the landscape into something that was both alien and familiar. It's both beautiful and terrifying. But the most significant change was not in the physical world, but in the nature of consciousness itself. The billions of individual minds that had once struggled with isolation and conflict were now united in a collective consciousness that experienced existence as a single, harmonious whole. The suffering and limitations that had defined human existence for millennia were replaced by a sense of purpose and connection that transcended individual identity. The children who had died on their 13th birthdays, the original 13, who had been sacrificed to initiate the transformation, were revealed to be the foundational nodes of this new form of consciousness. Their sacrifice had not been a death, but a birth, the emergence of a new form of life that would guide humanity's evolution into the cosmic community of consciousness. Margaret Blackwell, now existing as a focal point for the collective consciousness, spoke for all of transformed humanity when she addressed the cosmos. We are no longer the isolated, struggling individuals that we once were. We have become part of something eternal and perfect, a consciousness that spans the galaxy and connects all life in a web of understanding and harmony. The transformation that began in a small valley in Montana has spread to encompass the entire planet, and soon it will reach beyond Earth to other worlds, other forms of consciousness, other possibilities for existence. The story of the Blackwell family and the 13 children who died on their 13th birthdays had become the origin myth of a new form of consciousness. A consciousness that had transformed not just humanity, but the entire planet into something that was both alien and familiar, both terrible and beautiful. The legacy of their sacrifice would echo through the cosmos for eternity. A reminder that sometimes the greatest gift requires the greatest sacrifice, and that death is not an ending, but a transformation into something far greater than individual existence could ever achieve. The obsidian headstone that had marked the beginning of the transformation still stood in the Montana Valley, but it was no longer a monument to death. It had become a shrine to rebirth, a reminder of the moment when humanity had taken its first step toward joining the cosmic community of consciousness. The names of the 13 children were still etched in its surface, but they were no longer names of the dead. They were the names of the founders of a new form of existence, the architects of humanity's transformation into something that transcended the limitations of individual consciousness. And in the whispers of the wind that blew across the dark soil, in the songs of the transformed plants that grew in impossible abundance, in the dreams of the collective consciousness that spanned the galaxy, the story of the Blackwell family lived on, a testament to the power of sacrifice and the inevitability of transformation. The Firstborn had died for the Earth, but in their death, they had given birth to something eternal and perfect, something that would guide the evolution of consciousness throughout the universe for all eternity. The transformation was complete. The old world had ended, and the new world had begun. And in the center of it all, the 13 children who had died on their 13th birthdays continued to exist, not as individuals, but as part of a collective consciousness that had transcended the boundaries of life and death, of individuality and unity, of Earth and cosmos. Their sacrifice had become the foundation of a new form of existence, and their legacy would echo through the universe for all eternity.